Was 34 years old when I got a Facebook message from a woman I had never met. She said she had been looking for me for 6 years. She said she knew things about my childhood bedroom, the color of my curtains, the crack in the ceiling above my bed, the way the radiator knocked at night. She said she knew because she used to fall asleep listening to the same radiator through a shared wall. And then she said the words that stopped my heart. I think I'm the friend they told you wasn't real. I need to go back 28 years. I was 6 years old, living in a large, old house that my parents were in the process of renovating. The house was a Victorian, bought cheaply because it needed significant work, and my parents spent most of my early childhood slowly transforming it room by room. There were sections of the house we didn't use, closed-off rooms, locked doors, a back staircase that we were told was unsafe. My world was essentially the front half of the first floor and the main bedrooms upstairs. My parents were not negligent people. I want to be very clear about that before I go any further. They were good parents, present, attentive, loving. But they were also two people in their late 20s who worked full-time and were renovating a Victorian house on evenings and weekends, which meant they were frequently tired and distracted and relying on a 6-year-old to occupy herself reasonably well. Round the age of 6, I began talking about a friend named Clara. Clara, I told my parents, lived behind the wall. I mean this literally. I believed with complete 6-year-old sincerity that my friend Clara lived somewhere in the walls of our house and that we spoke to each other through a small heating grate in my bedroom floor. I talked to her every night before I went to sleep. She told me stories. I told her about school. We played a game where we described things to each other and tried to guess what they were. My parents were not alarmed by Clara. Children have imaginary friends. Children who live in large, slightly spooky Victorian houses and have overactive imaginations especially have imaginary friends. My mother noted it in my baby book, around age 6, developed elaborate imaginary friend named Clara who lives in the house. Very detailed and specific, possibly future writer. I kept talking about Clara until I was 8. Then, for reasons I couldn't explain even then, she stopped. I stopped hearing the voice through the grate. I stopped telling my parents about things Clara had said. They assumed I had simply outgrown the imaginary friend phase, the way children do. I grew up. The house was fully renovated. I went to middle school, high school, college. I thought about Clara occasionally, the way you think about a particularly vivid dream from years ago with a fondness that has no real substance behind it. She was my imaginary friend. She was not real. The voice through the grate was the sound of the house itself, the pipes and the settling and the wind, interpreted by a lonely and imaginative child. That was the story I told myself for 26 years. Then I received the message. The woman's name was Carolyn. She used to go by Carol as a child, which I had apparently shortened to Clara when I was 6 and had trouble with certain sounds. She told me that she had lived in the back portion of our house during the years I was 6 and 7 and 8, not as a ghost, not as a fantasy, as an actual human child. I'm going to let that settle for a moment, because when I read it in the message, I had to let it settle for a very long time. Our house, she explained, had been converted into 2 separate dwelling units at some point in its history before my parents bought it. The back section had its own entrance from the rear alley, its own small kitchen, its own staircase. My parents, in purchasing the property, had known this. The house was listed as a single-family home that had previously been used as a duplex, but they assumed the back section was empty and sealed off. They had not thoroughly inspected it before purchase because they were buying a distressed property at auction and had done a brief walkthrough that did not include the back half. The back section was not empty. Carolyn had lived there with her mother, a woman named Patricia who had been renting the space from the previous owner under an informal arrangement that had no paper trail. Patricia was not a bad person, from what Carolyn describes, but she was in an extremely precarious situation, undocumented, barely employed, terrified of any official attention. When new owners moved in, she did not come forward. She kept Carolyn very quiet. They lived in the back of the house for 2 years before circumstances changed, and they were able to move to an apartment. Patricia had finally saved enough to rent properly. During those 2 years, Carolyn, then 5 and 6 and 7 years old, would sometimes whisper through the heating grate that connected to my room. She was desperately lonely. She wasn't allowed outside, wasn't enrolled in school, had no friends. She could hear me moving around in my room, hear me talking to my toys, hear the radio I kept on at night. One evening, she whispered hello, half expecting nothing back. I said hello back immediately, because I was 6 and I had no filter, and I thought perhaps the house was talking to me, which seemed reasonable. We talked every night for 2 years. She told me her name was Carol. I called her Clara because I couldn't quite say it right. She told me stories she made up, elaborate, imaginative stories about kingdoms underground and talking animals and hidden doors, because stories were how she passed the long, quiet days. I told her about school, about my teacher, about the girl in my class who had cried over a broken crayon. She said she used to press her face against the grate and look at the sliver of light coming from my room and pretend that she was there, in a room with curtains and a lamp and a friend. She knew about the crack in the ceiling because I had told her about it. She knew about the radiator because it was in her wall too. She knew the color of my curtains because I had described them in exhaustive detail one evening when we were playing our guessing game. When her mother was finally able to move them out, they left quickly and quietly in the night. Carolyn said she wanted to say goodbye to me through the grate, but her mother wouldn't let her make any sound. She just pressed her hand flat against the wall and said goodbye without speaking. I spent 3 weeks verifying everything before I agreed to meet her. I am aware of how that might sound. She had reached out with something heartfelt, and I responded with a background check, essentially. But I had to know. I needed the story to be real before I let myself feel how much I needed it to be real. I talked to my parents. My mother cried in a way I had never seen her cry before, not from sadness exactly, but from a kind of overwhelmed astonishment. She remembered the back entrance. She remembered vaguely wondering in the first months whether someone had been in the back of the house, finding small evidence, a cup, a child's shoe she thought had been left by a previous occupant. She had never pieced it together. My father, characteristically, went immediately into problem-solving mode and started pulling out the original property records. We found Patricia in the records eventually. Her name appeared on a utility account from the previous owner's time. We found enough details to confirm the shape of Carolyn's story, if not every particular. I met Carolyn on a Tuesday afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between our two cities. She was 40 years old and had brown hair and a slightly nervous way of smiling that made her look like she was waiting to be told she got something wrong. She was a dental hygienist. She had 2 kids, a mortgage, a rescue dog named Franklin. She was in every observable way a completely ordinary person. Except that she was also the voice through my floor, who had told me stories for 2 years when I was 6. We sat in that coffee shop for 4 hours. We cried twice. We laughed more than twice. She remembered details of our conversations that I had completely forgotten, but that rang true the moment she described them. A story she had told about a girl who could walk through mirrors, a game we played trying to describe colors without using their names, a night when I had been upset about something at school, and she had whispered it's okay through the grate until I stopped sniffling. I told my parents I was fine after that meeting. I wasn't entirely fine. I was something more complicated than fine. I was rearranged. Here is what I keep coming back to, 3 months after that first message arrived. For 26 years, I believed the thing that comforted me most as a child was not real. I had a friend, a genuine, warm, imaginative, lonely little girl, and the adults in both our lives had inadvertently conspired to make her invisible. My parents because they didn't know she was there. Her mother because she was too afraid to exist on paper. Yet she was real. She was real the whole time. The voice that told me stories, the friend who listened to me describe my teacher and my broken crayons and the crack in my ceiling. She was a real child in real need on the other side of a wall. And the friendship we had, conducted in whispers through a heating grate, was as genuine as any friendship can be. I sometimes think about what it meant that both of us needed each other, that she was lonely enough to risk speaking and I was open enough to answer, that we built something small and sustained and real in the gap between our separate isolations. Carolyn and I talk every week now, sometimes on the phone, sometimes by text. She came to my daughter's birthday party last month and watched 6-year-olds run around the backyard with the expression of someone witnessing a miracle they only half believe in. I introduced her to my parents, which was one of the stranger moments of my life, watching my mother hug this woman and say, "You were there the whole time," and watching Carolyn nod and say, "Yes, I was right there." Tricia passed away a few years ago. Carolyn made peace with her mother before she died, which is its own complicated story. But Carolyn has said she thinks her mother would have been relieved to know that the child on the other side of the wall turned out okay, that the friendship survived somehow, that the grate carried something worth carrying. I don't know what the lesson is supposed to be. I genuinely don't know how to wrap this into a conclusion that makes clean sense. All I know is that the thing I was told wasn't real was real. That the friend I mourned as an adult thing to let go of was never something I needed to let go of. That somewhere in the foundation of who I am, there is a small girl pressing her face against a grate, and she deserves to know that someone heard her. Somebody always hears you, even when you're invisible, even when you're whispering, even when you're not sure you're allowed to exist out loud. I'm so glad you found me, Clara. I'm so glad you knocked on the wall.